For over 1,000 years, the Catholic Church maintained an unbroken line of male popes and built the most powerful institution in Western civilization on that foundation. Then, somewhere in the 900s, a woman allegedly sat on the throne of St. Peter, ruled Christendom, and was erased so completely that entire libraries were rewritten to make her disappear. The burning parchment, the midnight rewrites, the marble papal throne literally redesigned with a hole in the seat so future candidates could be anatomically verified before coronation. None of that suggests a calm institution dismissing a silly rumor. So why did the most powerful organization in human history spend centuries obsessively, expensively, and sometimes violently denying that Pope Joan ever existed? In the Lateran Palace in Rome, there is a marble throne with a hole in its seat. Not a crack from age, not damage from war. A deliberate, keyhole-shaped opening carved into the seat with full intention, used for centuries as part of the formal ceremony of welcoming a new pope. It is called the sedia stercoraria, and the question it raises is the only one that matters tonight. Picture the scene. A newly elected pope, dressed in white, is led through candlelit corridors by a procession of cardinals. The air smells of beeswax and cold stone, the kind of damp that gets into your robes and stays there. The procession is solemn. The occasion is historic. And then the Pope is asked to sit on this particular chair while a young deacon kneels, reaches beneath the seat, and conducts what can only be described as a verification. The deacon's job was to confirm, in Latin, that the new pontiff possessed two items of standard male anatomy. The declaration, when satisfied, was duos habet et bem pendentes. He has two, and they hang well. This was official church business. Witnesses present. Ceremony recorded. Don't worry. It gets stranger. This ritual continued with some variation and considerable historical murkiness from somewhere around the 9th century onward. Multiple accounts place the chair in use during papal inaugurations well into the Renaissance. Giovanni della Casa mentioned it. Platina, the Vatican's own librarian, mentioned it. The chair itself still exists. You can visit the Vatican museums and look at it. It will look back, judgmentally. And yet no official Vatican document ever explains why the check was necessary. The Church, an institution that documented everything, that had scribes scratching quill across vellum at every conceivable occasion, that preserved communion recipes and land disputes from the 6th century, never once wrote down the official reason for the hole in the chair. The smell of burning parchment, it turns out, can be just as revealing as the documents that survive it. That silence is what this story is actually about. Because silence, when it comes from an institution with the organizational capacity of the medieval Catholic Church, is not an accident. It is a policy. And the frantic, sustained, occasionally embarrassing campaign to erase a particular legend from history may tell us more about what the Church feared than any document it chose to keep. The legend is this. Sometime in the 9th century, a woman became pope. She reigned for over 2 years. She was brilliant, educated, possibly beloved. And she was only discovered when she went into labor during a papal procession through the streets of Rome. Whether that story is true is a question historians have been arguing about since at least the 13th century. But the Church's reaction to the story, the rewrites, the deletions, the centuries of official fury directed at a legend they claimed was obviously false, is documented. It is real, it happened. And it starts, as so many uncomfortable truths do, with a chair. By the year 850, Rome had roughly 30,000 people living inside it. At its peak, the city had held over 1 million. What remained was less a metropolis and more memory wearing a city's skin. The forums where senators once argued the fate of empires were, by the 9th century, grazing land. Cattle wandered between the columns of the Temple of Saturn. The smell of manure drifted through arches that had once framed triumphal processions. Vines crept up marble. Pigs rooted in the rubble of what had been the ancient world's greatest library district. If you stood on the Palatine Hill around 850 and looked down, you would have seen not the glory of Rome, but a very confused cow standing in it. The population that remained was sick, hungry, and extremely opinionated about who should be pope. This is the period historians sometimes call the pornocracy, which sounds more entertaining than it was. The term refers to the domination of the papacy by Roman aristocratic families, particularly certain very ambitious noblewomen, who treated the throne of St. Peter roughly the way a chess player treats a pawn: convenient, movable, occasionally sacrificed for position. Between 800 and 900, Rome cycled through popes at a rate that suggests either genuine spiritual crisis or a truly catastrophic HR problem. Some popes were elected as teenagers. At least one was strangled. Several were exiled, blinded, or simply disappeared in ways the historical record declines to specify. Don't worry. The intellectual climate was equally cheerful. Literacy in 9th century Rome existed in monasteries and almost exclusively there. These were small, cold, candle-lit islands of scholarship surrounded by a continent of violent illiteracy. Monks copied manuscripts with numb fingers in rooms where the ink sometimes froze. The knowledge of the ancient world survived because of these fragile human chains, which is either beautiful or alarming, depending on how much you trust chains. And here is the thing about chaos. It creates gaps. When power changes hands every 18 months, when record-keeping is inconsistent, when half the city's administrators cannot read and the other half are busy plotting, extraordinary things can slip through the machinery unnoticed. A talented, educated, ambitious person who happened to be the wrong gender might, in precisely this environment, find the machinery briefly unwatched. 9th century Rome was not a place designed to notice details. It was a place designed to survive the week, which makes it exactly the right moment for a woman with exceptional intelligence and exceptional patience to begin a very careful climb. Where that climb started, and how she built the disguise that would carry her to the highest office in Christendom, is where we go next. Her name, the chroniclers tell us, was Joan. She was born in Mainz somewhere around the year 818 to an English missionary family who had come to the German territories to save souls and stayed, as missionaries sometimes do, because the work was never quite finished. The earliest full account of her story comes from the Dominican chronicler Jean de Mailly, writing around 1250 in his Chronica Universalis Mettensis. He is not a name that comes up at dinner parties often. He should be. Because Jean de Mailly is the man who first put the essential bones of the legend into writing, and what he wrote was extraordinary. A woman disguised as a man. A pope. And an ending that the church would spend the next several centuries pretending not to remember. But we are not at the ending yet. We are in Mainz in the early 9th century, where a girl is learning things she was not supposed to know. The learning was the scandal before the scandal. Female literacy in Carolingian Europe was not merely uncommon. It was actively discouraged. The women who could read tended to be either aristocratic or cloistered, and usually both. For a girl of ordinary birth to develop genuine scholarly ability, she would have needed unusual access and an almost ferocious determination. Joan, the chroniclers say, had both. She fell in love, as young scholars sometimes do, with another scholar. He was a Benedictine monk. The details of their arrangement are left tactfully vague by most sources, which is probably for the best. What the chronicles agree on is what came next. She cut her hair, took his habit, took his name, and became Johannes Anglicus, John of England, a man on paper, and eventually in everyone else's perception. Johannes Anglicus was brilliant. That part is consistent across every version of the story. He studied in Athens, which in the 9th century meant sitting at the feet of whatever intellectual tradition had survived the general collapse, absorbing Greek philosophy and theology with the kind of focus that only comes from someone who knows the doors are not usually open to them. Then came Rome. In Rome, Johannes became a papal notary, then a lecturer of such reputation that cardinals attended his talks, then a cardinal himself. And then, sometime around 855, when Leo IV died and the church needed to select his successor, Johannes Anglicus was elected pope. The chroniclers assigned her pontificate a duration of 2 years, 5 months, and 4 days. She would have presided over rituals in the Basilica of St. Peter, processed through the city in white, heard confession, issued doctrine. All of it conducted in a body the church believed was male and was not. What makes the legend structurally credible, at least to medieval audiences, is the papal record itself. The gap between Leo IV and Benedict III is genuinely irregular. The dates blur in ways historians still argue about, which gave the legend exactly the kind of administrative shadow in which a secret could theoretically hide. Whether she hid there is the question that nearly broke the church's careful story. How she was allegedly discovered, and what came next, is considerably less comfortable. The procession moved through Rome on a late summer morning, the kind that smells of baked stone and rotting fruit and incense layered over both. Thousands of Romans pressing against the narrow lane between the Colosseum and the Church of San Clemente. The Pope was mounted or walking, depending on which version you read, robed in white, surrounded by cardinals and guards and the full ceremonial weight of the 9th century church. The crowd would have been close. The noise would have been enormous. Bells, chanting, the shuffle of sandals on cobblestone. And then, somewhere in that press of bodies and heat and ritual, Joan collapsed. The chroniclers are specific about the location to a degree that feels almost deliberate. Not a vague street in Rome. That exact lane between those exact landmarks, which every Roman would have known. Jean de Mailly does not linger on the physical details in a way that would have felt clinical. He does not need to. The image lands on its own. A pope, in labor, on a public street. What happened next depends on who is telling the story. Some accounts say she died there in the street in full view of the procession and the crowd. A swift, terrible, and extremely public ending. Others say the cardinals, recovering from what must have been a genuinely staggering few moments, had her removed before she died. A quieter death, but still a death. A third version, the one that carries a faint note of mercy, suggests she survived and was exiled, quietly, to some unnamed place where the church would not have to look at her or think about what had happened. The version involving being dragged behind a horse appears in later sources and is almost certainly the kind of embellishment that stories accumulate when enough people are angry enough to add to them. Don't worry about which version is true. They can't all be true, and the church was not, at that particular moment, keeping careful notes. What is consistent across nearly every account is what came after. For centuries, according to multiple independent sources, papal processions deliberately avoided that lane. Not officially. Not in any document that survives with an explanation attached. They simply went a different way. A small marble marker or shrine allegedly stood at the spot for generations, noted by various medieval travelers, described in enough separate sources that historians cannot simply dismiss it as one person's invention. A street that popes would not walk. A marker with no official name. Draw your own conclusions, which is something the medieval church was extremely reluctant to let people do. The emotional architecture of the story, whatever its literal truth, rests on something genuinely devastating. Joan, in every version, is not destroyed by her intellect. Her intellect was extraordinary enough to get her elected to the most powerful office in Western Christendom. She is destroyed by biology, by the body she had, in some sense, spent her entire adult life concealing, managing, working around, presenting differently to a world that would have closed every door the moment it perceived her correctly. The irony has the specific cruelty of irony that history seems to produce with troubling regularity. She survived the scholarship. She survived the disguise. She survived the politics of a 9th century Rome that was, to put it gently, not a forgiving environment for anyone. And what ended everything was not discovery, not exposure, not someone pulling back a curtain. It was her own body on a public street in front of thousands of witnesses, making a kind of announcement that no amount of authority or intellect or institutional power could interrupt. Imagine standing in that crowd. Imagine what you would have made of it. Imagine what you would have told your children that night. The church, faced with the same moment, made a different choice entirely. It chose to forget, or rather, it chose to try. That project of forgetting, which would consume papal officials, historians, and apologists for the next several hundred years, is where the story gets genuinely interesting. Martin of Opava wrote her down without apology. Around 1265, the Dominican friar and papal chaplain produced his Chronicon Pontificum et Imperatorum, a chronicle of popes and emperors that was, by any measure, an establishment document. Martin was not a heretic muttering in a corner. He was not a Protestant reformer with an agenda. He was a man whose job title contained the word papal. He worked inside the institution. He ate, metaphorically speaking, at the church's table. And in his orderly list of the successors of St. Peter between Leo IV and Benedict III, he placed her. Johannes Anglicus, born in Mainz, reigned for 2 years, 7 months, and 4 days. Ended badly in a street, as you already know. Matter of fact. Calm. Listed the way you might list a piece of furniture in a household inventory. Here is the detail that tends to stop people cold. Martin's chronicle became one of the most widely copied texts of the medieval period. Historians estimate it survives in over 400 manuscript copies scattered across European monasteries and libraries. It was not a suppressed document. It was not whispered about. It was reproduced by hand, hundreds of times, by monks who presumably read what they were copying. Nobody appears to have panicked. Jean de Mailly had already included her in his chronicle in the 1240s, which you encountered briefly in the previous chapter in a different context. Bartolomeo Fiadoni, the Italian Dominican who wrote a universal chronicle in the early 1300s, included her too. Different writers. Different decades. Same woman in the list. And then there is Siena Cathedral, which is where the story acquires a certain theatrical texture. Among the row of papal portrait busts that decorated the cathedral, running along the nave like a stone guest list of heaven's management, there reportedly stood a bust labeled, with remarkable specificity, Johannes VIII female from England. Not anonymous. Named. Gendered. The label did not hedge. It did not say alleged. It said what it said in a cathedral in full view of anyone who walked through the door for generations. The bust stood there until 1601 when Cardinal Francesco Maria Tarugi had it replaced, quietly, with a bust of Pope Zachary. The church by that point had revised its position on whether Joan was acceptable dinner conversation. But here is the irony that deserves to be held up to the light and examined slowly. For nearly 400 years, the church that would later insist Joan never existed had, in various official and semi-official capacities, simply included her. In chronicles, in cathedral art, in the institutional memory of the papacy itself. The denial came later. The embarrassment came later. The erasure was a project that had a beginning, which means there was a time before the beginning when nobody felt the need to erase anything at all. Medieval Catholicism was not, broadly speaking, an institution comfortable with ambiguity. And yet, on this particular question, it managed several centuries of remarkably relaxed record-keeping. What changed is a story involving the Reformation, a Protestant argument, and a church suddenly very motivated to audit its own history. Galen of Pergamon, writing in the 2nd century, had a theory about the human body that medieval European physicians accepted almost without question for over 1,000 years. His argument, put simply, was that male and female were not opposites. They were degrees. Women were men whose heat had failed during development, leaving their reproductive organs inverted, tucked inside rather than expressed outward. The same basic anatomy rearranged by temperature. One sex on a sliding scale. This is not a fringe idea someone scribbled in a margin. This was the medical consensus. It sat in university curricula. Physicians across Europe were trained on it, which means that when a medieval person heard a story about a woman passing as a man for years, the instinctive response was not necessarily disbelief. Bodies were understood as somewhat negotiable. The categories were firm in theory and softer in practice. And the saints made it softer still. Marina the monk entered a male monastery disguised as a man and lived there for years without discovery. Pelagia of Antioch, a repentant actress, spent decades as a male hermit named Pelagius. Hildegund of Schonau, a 12th century German woman, traveled to the Holy Land dressed as a boy entered a Cistercian monastery, and was only discovered to be female when she died and someone prepared the body. These women were not cautionary tales. They were celebrated. Their feast days were observed. They appeared in hagiographies read aloud at mealtimes in the very monasteries where monks copied chronicles that included Pope Joan. The Church did not find cross-dressing women scandalous when the purpose was devotion. It found them inspiring. Which brings us to the theological elegance of Joan's story, because medieval readers had a very tidy framework for interpreting her exposure. God had allowed a woman to rise to the throne of Peter, and then God had chosen the most dramatically public, maximally undeniable moment possible to reveal the deception. A papal procession, a street, an audience. The humiliation was divine in both senses. It was embarrassing, yes. It was also, to a medieval mind, obviously intentional. God was making a point. That reading transformed a potential institutional scandal into a moral parable. Joan's story did not indict the Church. It illustrated providence. The system had been tested, the fraud exposed, the lesson delivered. The story was useful. It was theologically comfortable. The medieval mind had room for all of this. The soft body, the holy disguise, the punishing revelation, in a way that a post-Reformation institution, hardened by decades of doctrinal warfare, simply would not. That hardening is where we are headed next. Martin Luther was not a subtle man. In 1517, when he sat down to dismantle the authority of Rome, he did not limit himself to theology. He collected embarrassments, and Pope Joan was, from his perspective, one of the finest embarrassments available. Luther referenced her with barely concealed delight. Here was proof, he argued, that the papacy was not a divinely protected institution, not a throne shielded by God's hand, but a thoroughly human operation capable of being fooled by anyone clever enough to wear the right hat. If a woman sat on Peter's chair for 2 years and nobody noticed, what exactly was the Holy Spirit doing? The question was rhetorical. The implication was devastating. He was not alone. Protestant polemicists across Germany and the Netherlands picked up the story and ran with it straight to the printing press, which was, conveniently, a technology that had not existed during Joan's supposed reign in the 800s. By the 1520s and 1530s, woodcuts of Pope Joan were circulating across Europe. She appeared giving sermons, wearing the tiara, holding the papal keys, sometimes mid-labor in the middle of a procession, all rendered in the blunt, emphatic style of pamphlet art designed to be understood by people who could not read the caption. The image did the argument for you. The theological danger was not just embarrassing. It was existential. Apostolic succession, the unbroken chain of authority passing from Peter through every legitimate pope down to the present, was the foundation on which papal sacramental power rested. Every valid mass, every valid ordination, every valid absolution flowed through that chain. If Joan had sat in that chair, performing those functions, performing them while female and therefore, in Catholic doctrine, incapable of valid ordination, then the chain had a gap. And a chain with a gap is not a chain. Every sacrament performed during her pontificate became suspect. Every bishop she ordained. Every priest those bishops later ordained. The contamination did not stay historical. It rippled forward. Protestants found this either genuinely alarming or enormously funny, depending on their mood. possibly both. And Rome felt it. The same story that medieval chroniclers had copied down without visible anxiety, that Dominican friars had included in their encyclopedias as a mildly curious entry, that pilgrims had used as a landmark on their walking tours of the city, was suddenly a weapon. The warmth had gone out of the room entirely. The Counter-reformation that followed the Council of Trent was not merely a theological project. It was an archival one. Church historians began looking at Pope Joan with newly hostile eyes. The records were reviewed. The sources were questioned. The methodology that medieval scholars had never needed to apply, because the story had never needed defeating, was now applied with considerable urgency. The legend that had spent 3 centuries as a harmless curiosity was reclassified, quietly and then loudly, as a Protestant fabrication. Which raises an obvious question. If the Church now needed to prove the story was invented, who exactly had done the inventing? That answer required its own erasure. In 1601, a stone face was removed from Siena Cathedral and quietly replaced with someone more acceptable. The bust had been there for over a century, one among a long row of papal portraits lining the cathedral wall, and it bore a label that read in straightforward Latin, "Johannes VIII, a woman of English birth. Pope Clement VIII ordered it gone." In its place went a bust of Pope Zachary, a perfectly real, perfectly male pope who had never caused anyone a moment of theological distress. If you visit Siena today, you can still see the row. You will not find Joan. You will find Zachary sitting in her spot, wearing her borrowed position in history like a coat that does not quite fit. That is, if you will forgive the observation, a very specific thing to do to a fairy tale. The Siena bust was not the beginning. That honor belongs to Onofrio Panvinio, a Vatican-affiliated scholar who in 1562 produced a systematic argument that Joan had never existed. Panvinio worked through the sources methodically, questioned their dates, challenged their authors, and concluded that the entire tradition was a confusion, a muddle, a misunderstanding that careful historians could now put to rest. He was thorough. He was funded. He was not working alone in the margins of some monastery. This was an organized scholarly project, and it carried the weight of institutional support behind every footnote. Then came Caesar Baronius. His Annales Ecclesiastici, assembled across the final decades of the 1500s, was one of the most ambitious works of church history ever attempted, a volume-by-volume reconstruction of the Christian past, authoritative and enormous. Baronius devoted careful attention to the years between Pope Leo IV and Pope Benedict III, the precise window where Joan was said to have reigned. He closed the gap. He filled the space with documentation, with dates, with the argument that there was simply no room in the timeline for a female pontificate. No gap, no Joan. The math, he insisted, did not permit her. The math, it should be noted, required quite a lot of work to reach that conclusion. Meanwhile, something was happening to manuscripts. Chronicles that had included Joan's story, copied faithfully for 2 or 3 centuries, began appearing in altered forms. Marginalia appeared in old texts, notes added by later hands casting doubt on the relevant passages. Some copies that should have contained her entry were missing pages, not dramatically, not obviously, just quietly incomplete in the one place that mattered. Manuscript alteration in this period was not unusual. Texts were corrected, updated, improved by successive owners. But the pattern here had a direction, and the direction was consistent, and the consistency was, to put it gently, suggestive. You do not add a skeptical marginal note to a story that nobody believes. This is the irony that the erasure campaign could not escape. Medieval chroniclers had included Pope Joan without apparent alarm because the story did not require defending against anything. It was just a story, strange and cautionary, passed along the way interesting things get passed along. It took the Reformation to transform her into a threat, and it took the Counter-reformation to make the Church respond, and the response, across 4 centuries, was so sustained and so resource-intensive and so organizationally serious that it became its own kind of evidence. Fairy tales do not receive this treatment. Nobody commissions a Vatican scholar to disprove the existence of a dragon. Nobody replaces a stone face in a cathedral because a legend has become inconvenient. Nobody spends 4 centuries closing a gap in a timeline that was never there to begin with, unless something about that gap has started to feel genuinely dangerous. The erasure, in other words, is the record now. Not the only record, but an unmistakable one. And it points in a direction that Caesar Baronius, for all his considerable industry, could not quite paper over. Which brings us to the question that remains after all the busts have been swapped and all the manuscripts have been corrected. What do we actually know? And how do we know it? For centuries, papal processions leaving the Lateran Palace took a specific route through Rome. It was well documented, ceremonially important, and almost everyone who traveled it made a small, unexplained detour around a street running between the Colosseum and the Church of San Clemente. No official reason was ever given. No decree explained it. The procession simply went another way, quietly, as though the street itself had done something to deserve the cold shoulder. That is, as historical anomalies go, a rather loud silence. The street in question is where multiple medieval sources place Joan's death. The moment of her collapse and exposure during a procession in 853 or thereabouts. Her son, allegedly born right there on the cobblestones, in front of the cardinals, in front of God, in front of everyone. If you wanted to design an embarrassing location, you could not improve on it. And for centuries, Rome's most powerful religious institution quietly walked around that spot without explaining why. Travelers visiting Rome in the 13 and 1400s reported a small shrine or marker stone at the site, a memorial of some kind, noted by multiple independent witnesses across different eras who had no obvious reason to coordinate their accounts. Memorials, as a rule, do not grow at locations where nothing happened. Then there is the question of the coins. Papal coinage from the 850s contains gaps and dating irregularities that numismatists have been quietly puzzling over for a long time. The sequence between Leo IV and Benedict III has never resolved cleanly. There are issues of overlap, of dating inconsistency, of a period that does not account for itself as neatly as the official timeline would require. This does not prove a female pope was minting currency. It proves that something in the accounting of that period does not quite add up, and that the something corresponds, with uncomfortable precision, to exactly the window Joan was said to occupy. Coincidences accumulate. At some point, they begin to resemble a pattern. Perhaps nothing illustrates the Church's impossible position quite like the sedia stercoraria. This was a ceremonially perforated chair, and for a stretch of the medieval and Renaissance periods, new popes were seated in it during their investiture while a cardinal or official physically confirmed their sex. The verification was real. The chair was real. You can find descriptions of it in multiple sources across multiple centuries, and one version of it still sits in the Vatican museums today, looking slightly embarrassed about the whole situation. The The Church, while insisting Joan had never existed, continued using this chair. There is no satisfying explanation for a verification procedure in an institution that claims there was never anything to verify. It is the theological equivalent of installing a smoke detector and then insisting there has never been a fire. Taken individually, each piece is arguable. The detour might have a forgotten liturgical explanation. The coins might reflect administrative chaos. The chair might be a misunderstood relic. The memorial stone might be a monument to something else entirely. Taken together, they describe an institution that knew something, adjusted for it practically, and then spent considerable energy insisting it had never happened. The cobblestones remember differently. And so, it turns out, does the paper trail. Donna Woolfolk-Cross published her novel Pope Joan in 1996, and a story that had been quietly moldering in academic footnotes suddenly found itself on airport bookshelves next to the thrillers. That is the honest origin of most modern public interest in Joan. Not a papal confession, not a newly discovered manuscript. A novel. Cross did her research carefully, drew on legitimate medieval sources, and was transparent about what she was fictionalizing. The book sold millions of copies in dozens of languages. A German film adaptation followed in 2009. Joan, after centuries of attempted erasure, had become a bestseller. Academic historians, predictably, were not entirely thrilled about this. The mainstream scholarly position on Pope Joan is clear and, to be fair, reasonably argued. Most medievalists consider her a legend, probably originating in satirical or polemical writing from the 9th or 10th century that gradually calcified into accepted fact. Stories do this. They acquire texture and detail and corroborating witnesses the way old furniture acquires scratches. By the time everyone is citing everyone else, the original joke or cautionary tale has become indistinguishable from history. The credulous medieval chronicle tradition, which also recorded dog-headed men and raining fish, is not always the most discerning of source environments. And yet, Peter Stanford's 1998 work, The She-Pope, took the circumstantial case seriously, not as a credulous true believer, but as a journalist who found the weight of unexplained evidence worth sustained attention. Stanford cataloged the medieval sources, the physical anomalies, and the Church's own contradictory behavior with the particular stubbornness of someone who has noticed that the official explanation explains rather less than it promises. He was not alone. A persistent minority of serious scholars have argued that the sheer breadth of medieval acceptance across geography, across denomination, across languages, represents something harder to dismiss than a single persistent rumor. Here is the honest position that responsible historians on both sides eventually arrive at. We cannot prove Joan existed. The documentary record is fragmentary, the sources are late, and medieval chronicles were not peer-reviewed. But we also cannot fully explain why dozens of credible medieval writers, including some with no obvious motive for invention, insisted with apparent confidence that she had. We cannot explain the detour, the chair, the coins, the memorial stone, all of which you have already met and which the previous chapter made rather a thorough case about. Absence of proof is not proof of absence. It is merely absence. And in the case of Pope Joan, the absence itself has a suspicious shape. Which brings us, finally, to what the Church has actually said. Or more precisely, to the centuries of effort it spent saying nothing at all. In 1998, the Streisand effect did not yet have a name, but it had already been operating for roughly 1,000 years. The principle is simple enough. When a powerful institution works very hard to suppress a piece of information, it tends to produce exactly the opposite result. Barbara Streisand, in 2003, attempted to legally silence a photographer who had captured her Malibu home from the air. Before the lawsuit, 6 people had downloaded that photograph. After it, nearly 500,000 had. The attempt at erasure became the advertisement. The Church, to its considerable credit as an unwitting publicist, did this with Joan for centuries. Think about what sustained institutional denial actually signals. You do not spend generations revising chronicles, retiring traditions, and issuing theological corrections about things that do not worry you. You ignore them. You roll your eyes. You certainly do not convene serious scholarly apparatus to debunk the legend of, say, a fictional pope who turned into a salamander. Nobody is writing 800-page refutations of the salamander pope. The effort is itself the confession. Anxiety, expressed at institutional scale, has a particular smell to it, and it smells a great deal like guilt. This is not unique to the medieval church. It is the playbook, and institutions of every variety have been running it ever since. Governments have quietly reclassified documents that should have entered the public record. Corporations have scrubbed press releases from their own websites after the contents became inconvenient. Social media platforms have edited their own transparency reports with the particular brazenness of people who have correctly calculated that most users will not notice. In each case, the mechanism is identical. Someone in a position of authority looks at a piece of the historical record and decides that their future is better served without it. They delete, revise, reclassify, or simply wait for the people who remember to die. What they consistently fail to account for is that erasure leaves a shape. The gap where something used to be is itself a kind of evidence. Archives that are missing exactly the relevant years. Press releases that vanish on the day a lawsuit is filed. The chronicle tradition that skips a particular succession without explanation. Absence, as the previous chapter noted, is not neutral. It is information about the priorities of whoever controlled the record. Here is the uncomfortable truth about who gets to write history. It is not the people who lived it. It is the people with the resources to preserve, copy, commission, and destroy documents across generations. The Church was extraordinarily good at this. It ran the scriptoriums. It trained the scribes. When it wanted something remembered, it was remembered. When it wanted something forgotten, the machinery for forgetting was already in place and well maintained. And still, Joan survived. In satires, in chronicles, in coins, in the route that papal processions refused to walk for reasons nobody would quite explain. She survived because stories, once they achieve sufficient velocity, outrun the institutions trying to catch them. Which raises one final question, and it is perhaps the most interesting one. If the legend of Pope Joan is nothing more than medieval gossip dressed up as history, why does the Church's behavior continue to look so much like the behavior of an institution that knows something it would very much prefer you did not? Picture her at midnight in the Lateran Palace, sometime in the mid-9th century. The candles have burned low. The tiara sits on its stand across the room, that layered tower of gold and jeweled authority. And the woman who wears it during daylight hours is finally, briefly alone. The wool of her vestments is heavy and scratched against the skin. The palace smells of beeswax and cold stone and the particular must of rooms that have held powerful men for generations. Outside, Rome is dark and mostly sleeping. Inside, the most powerful office on earth is occupied by someone its architects never imagined. What did she feel if she existed? The question is almost unbearable, which is probably why it has lasted. Here is what her story exposed, regardless of whether she was real. The Church's authority rested on an unbroken chain of divine succession, pope to pope, reaching back to Peter himself, sanctified by God and therefore beyond question. Joan's legend introduced a single devastating crack in that foundation. Not theological, not political, biological. If a woman had held the office, even once, even briefly, then the succession was not what it claimed to be. The line had a gap. The divine mandate had a footnote. And institutions that derive their authority from the claim of perfection cannot survive footnotes. This is why she frightened them more than heretics did. Heretics were outside the Church. Joan, if real, had been at its center. The fear was not of women in general. It was of what one woman's existence would prove about the nature of sacred authority. She was not the last woman the Church would work to forget. The mystics whose writings were quietly shelved. The abbesses whose substantial medieval authority was gradually, administratively, reduced. The theologians permitted to think, but not to teach. The erasures that followed Joan's were less dramatic and more thorough, conducted not in a moment of institutional panic, but across centuries of patient reorganization. They left fewer obvious shapes in the record. They were better at it by then. And yet, in the Vatican museums today, there sits a chair with a hole carved in its seat. The sedia stercoraria, ancient and unexplained, still present, still occasionally pointed at by visitors who ask their guides what it was actually for. The guides give the approved answer. The chair sits there and says nothing, which is its own kind of reply. The woman who may have worn the tiara is gone. The question she left behind is still, quietly, taking up space in a room full of answers.